Hey guys, so now we're going to string everything together on our set, and I like to work from the back of the wing. Just makes it a little bit easier. That's where I like to tie my knots, because you want to put everything you don't want really seen all the time on the wing. So first thing, we've got this hole at the very end, and we are going to fish our string through that hole before we do anything else, just because we're going to start, getting the feathers all together and putting them on top of this spot. And if you don't do this first, then you have to fish yourself under the feathers. So the knot I like to do for this part is, I think, called a hangman's knot. I'm not entirely sure, but it's basically you do a couple of loops around your string line, and then you come back around through and then tighten that down. You can do more loops, but it's not necessary. What this does is it means that you can tighten this in this direction, but it won't come undone in the other. And that's what you want, is you want this down as tight as you can get it. The next step that we have is we have to get the first two feathers, which are not going to be tied down. They're just going to be, they're not going to be on the string line. They're just going to be held on with this part of the frame. Is we need to get them lined up so that they can be held up by this bolt here. Zoom back out. There's a bolt hole right here that we're going to be putting another bolt through to hold these two feathers up. The reason for putting that there is pretty important. What tends to happen is if you knock into something, these feathers will droop, and it'll kind of droop everything with it, and it looks really wonky when that happens, and it's pretty common if you don't put this second bolt underneath. So that's something we're going to have to do, so we need to make sure that we have room for that. And to make sure that we can also tape these down to this, we're going to need some scissors. And we are going to cut away. Thank you. We're going to cut away some of this. This is all going to be underneath other feathers and sleeves. So now that we have these on here and we know where everything's going to go, we're going to go ahead and cut away all this excess. It doesn't need to be too pretty, but just in case people are going to see it. So the next thing is you want this feather to go underneath this one, but over that bolt. And so what I do is I actually bend this wire around the bolt. I've done too much. So I want this to get under the bolt. I don't know, that we might need to move this bolt hole over a little bit. But we want the feather to be in line with this bar. This top feather, yeah, we're going to move the bolt hole over. But not a big deal, not hard to do. And we want this one to be straight along the top of we want this one to be in line with our framework. So this one's going to go here, and this one's going to come up just a little bit, and that's going to look real nice. What I need, straighten this out a little bit. So that's flat. And then what we're going to do is we are going to take electrical tape, for now, just to keep everything in place. We're going to just use electrical tape to tape these off. And again, once we're done stringing, we will go back and put a bolt underneath these so that they don't droop, but we need to drill a new hole, and we can do that afterwards. So with your first feather being the frontmost feather, you're then going to layer the rest of these where you want them. Sometimes it helps to figure out what your spacing is going to be and how it's going to look best, to just lay it out really quick and look at where you kind of have any issues, where you're going to need to modify your spacing in any way, and show you where that usually happens. Usually because you have this excess spacing at the joints, around any of the joints of your wing, you're going to have feathers that are, even while in parallel, will have too much of a space. So this is a pretty small set, and even in parallel you can see that there's like an inch gap between this edge and that center, whereas a lot of the times on the rest of them there's this overlap with the center quill. And you want that, you want everything, as soon as it starts to collapse, for everything to slide over one another. And if you ever have a spacing or gap like this, as soon as that happens, that means that these two can bind against one another. We really don't want that. So, when you're doing this spacing here, this one's not too bad. We can still get that overlap at about parallel. At larger wings, you may find that to close that gap so that everything flows nicely, you're going to actually need to bring it in and restart your curve with one feather kind of basically bridging the gap of that joint by crisscrossing them a little bit. In this case, we don't have to, thank you, Lord Almighty. It looks better if you don't have to. Another way to mitigate that on larger sets is you can make two of these and make this quill a little bit longer at the top and mount two to the same. And what you do is you bring it down and then you kind of create some angles to bring a feather to the center of this joint. The reason we do not put a feather at the center of this joint is because it will bind. This needs to be fairly tight to allow for that movement to be nice and smooth, and any feather that's in there will bind it. But you can artificially create a feather in that space by jumping the wire over and allowing it to fill in that gap. But on this small set, it's not necessary. So once we make sure that that's good, we're going to go ahead and fan this out again, and you'll notice that once we get to the elbow joint, we're having kind of the same issue, and things get a little more muddled in terms of that nice fanning progression, but still looks good, and coverage is more important than, and making sure there's no gaps is a little bit more important than making sure that that fan is perfect the whole way down. So now that we have that, and these two top ones are taped, what we're going to do is we are going to mark where we want to put our holes. And you can do this, it depends on what your what color they are. If you can mark it without it being noticeable, that's great. If not, you can always do this. It's blue tape. And what we're going to do is we're going to start at the end of where our bar is and where our string line begins. We're going to go ahead and mark where that is on the first feather. This one is going to be pretty tight. You're going to have this basically as tight as you can get it to the bar. And that will still not be perfectly straight. Really wish the lighting was better. So for the first 3 feathers or so, we're going to come pretty much straight down. These feathers are the ones that are under the most strain in terms of gravity, and that's why we have that bar that far out, is to give it a little bit more leverage. After that, we can start bringing it in. And on such a small set, I can actually bring it in pretty quickly. You want to make sure that you keep this line, you don't bring this line too far down. While that does make the feathers more stable, the farther down you have them, and the farther out this bar goes, so like if the bar went out to here and then the string line was down here, that would be super stable. The downside then being, though, is you have this string that you can see, right, that doesn't look so great. And so you kind of have to find a balance between what is stable and what looks good. When we have the feathers this far, the string line this far up, what it means is we can use our second layer of feathers to hide this first one. I can finish that off in a little bit. So the next thing we're going to do is taking a razor blade. You can use scissors. You can use, there's a hole punch method you could do. I just like using the razor because I'm lazy and it's easy. So I'm going to go along, double check this one. I'm going to go along and just cut an X in the feather. It's helpful to cut towards the quill so that you don't accidentally create or slice through your feather any farther than you want to. Right. Okay, that's good enough for government work right now. So now, now that we have that done, I'm going to go ahead and cut a hole through this first feather so that I can have access to that string line through the feather so that I have as much coverage as possible. Ha-ha! Okay, so we cut through this feather, cut a little hole so that we can access this string line, and we're going to feed that through that first feather. And then this feather is going to go on top of that one. We're going to go through the top. And then, whoops. And down through the bottom. Going to feed this through top again. To basically create a little loop circle around that quill. Now, this one is going to be as tight as I can get it, pretty much, to the bar. But what we need to do, and this is the part that requires some muscle memory, and you are going to do this 10 times before you figure it out, and that is okay. I like to pull things tight with this loop we just made to wherever you want your to wherever you want it to be. And then you're gonna create, basically, I call it a pretzel. Again, I don't know what any of these knots are called. I just figured them out. So I had this come through at the bottom. So going through the opposite side, in this case the top, I'm going to make a loop with this and then wrapping it around the back and then through again, I'm going to create a pretzel through that loop. Hopefully that makes sense. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to tighten the loop where I want it, and then I'm going to tighten that, and in succession tighten each of the pieces of the pretzel in series. And that gets it pretty much as tight as I can. And then it won't slip. So we're going to do the same thing again, and I'm going to get this at a different angle so you hopefully can see a little better. So we're going to basically do all of these the same all the way down. I'm just going to do a couple of these to show you how it's done, and then we will you'll have to rewind if you want to see more, because moving this camera is going to be a pain. So, through our holes, we're going to go in through the top, down through the bottom, and then up through the top again. Again, this one came through the bottom, so with my loop, I'm going to go around the top to create my loop, and then back around to create my pretzel, like so. So you again should have your loop coming through, and then a pretzel going around it. And I'm going to use the loop, is what tightens and loosens this, so I'm going to get this where I want it. I'm going to tighten that up around the pretzel, and then I'm going to, in succession, tighten up the pretzel. Okay, and that should create a little tiny knot around your loop. One more. Come in through the top, go around through the bottom, and then back around again through the top, which I don't know if I made this hole big enough. Oh, all right. Okay. Around again. So, using this loop to tighten and loosen, and then creating our pretzel, looping back through the loop, and then underneath this string to create pretzel. So loop, pretzel, loop, pretzel. Let's get it where I want. And then tighten up the loop. And then tightening up my pretzel. Like so. While you're working on these, you may find, especially on these first 6, that it's helpful to kind of give little tugs on the feathers to kind of mimic gravity, to make sure that they're not going like to open up under tension. It's best to pull near the knots that you've made. If you pull out at the edge, and you can, and I do, just to see how wibbly wobbly they're going to be, but like just keep in mind that as you do that, you're also going to get some warping rather than just what the force of gravity is going to do to this. You're pulling on the end and warping the wire, so you may find that like you see more gapping than will actually be there just because of that warping. If you pull from the area where the knot is, you'll see how much of a gap you're going to get with just a little bit of tension. You will no longer need to do that once you get past your a couple of feathers past your wrist joint. Once you get past there and towards the base feathers, a lot of them are pointing more straight down, and they're not under a lot of stress from gravity or the feathers past them. So, but these first feathers, you may want to kind of tug at the top a little bit and make sure that your spacing stays nice and even. Hopefully that helps. Please leave a comment below, and I will get to your questions as I can. Thanks.